King Charles was only moments away from entering one of the most sensitive palace briefings of his reign, when he suddenly stopped. Across the corridor stood a person who had no expected role in the meeting, no official invitation, and no reason to be near the sealed chamber. It was one of Meghan's closest aides. Within seconds, the king turned to his private secretary and issued a command that stunned everyone present. Cancel the briefing immediately. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles had called the meeting because trust inside the palace was cracking. Private discussions about royal communications, security access, overseas representation, and the limits separating working royals from Harry and Meghan's private operations had reached people outside the household before final decisions were approved. A palace briefing, the closed meeting where senior royal officials review sensitive matters before action, depended on absolute secrecy. Without it, every decision involving the Sussex couple could be weakened before the crown had spoken. The king moved toward the chamber expecting familiar faces. Instead, Meghan's aide stood beside a restricted corridor entrance, close enough to know who was arriving and when. Charles stopped so suddenly that the equerry behind him nearly stepped into his path. He lowered the folder in his hand, fixed his eyes on the visitor, and asked quietly, "Who authorized this person to be here?" No one answered. The silence became an accusation. The aide looked startled, yet did not immediately leave. That hesitation changed the moment. A simple mistake would have produced an apology and a quick retreat. This was different. The visitor remained still, as though waiting for someone inside the palace to intervene. Charles felt more than anger. He felt exposed where his authority was supposed to be protected. Camilla watched from several feet away and understood the danger. The queen consort had seen him irritated before, but this was colder. She recognized that he no longer viewed the encounter as a scheduling error. The monarch believed someone had deliberately placed an outsider near a meeting designed to tighten the boundaries now being challenged. Security officers checked the official visitor list that morning inside the palace. Meghan's aide was absent, yet a temporary internal pass had been issued under the authority of a senior palace office. Charles ordered every attendee to surrender access credentials for review, then watched as the chamber doors were sealed. The question was no longer why the aide had appeared. It was who inside the palace had opened the door, and what that person feared the briefing would reveal. Behind the cancelled meeting were not merely questions of access or protocol. There were wounded relationships, old promises, and loyalties divided across 2 continents. Charles saw an intrusion into the heart of the monarchy. Meghan saw a palace, still determined to keep her outside its walls. Between them stood an aide whose unexpected appearance threatened to reopen every unresolved conflict involving Harry, William, Camilla, and a family that had never truly recovered from its public fracture. Charles sat alone in his private study and removed his glasses. The king pressed his fingers against his forehead as the first security report was placed before him. His anger had not faded, but something heavier now sat beneath it. For years, he had tried to protect 2 things at once: his authority as sovereign and his fragile bond with Harry. A sovereign is the ruling monarch responsible for protecting the crown and its institutions. Yet each secret contact made those 2 duties harder to separate. The king had believed private communication might slowly rebuild trust without weakening royal boundaries. He had accepted difficult calls, unanswered letters, and long periods of silence, because Harry was still his son. Now the prince's world had entered palace space through an aide, an unlisted pass, and a connection no one had explained. Charles felt that patience had been used against him. Meghan received the urgent call far from London. She listened without interrupting, as her aide described the cancelled briefing and the king's reaction. Then she asked one sharp question. "Did you speak to Charles?" The silence that followed unsettled her. She was not only worried about the aide's presence, she feared what palace security might already have uncovered about calls made before the meeting. William viewed the incident more coldly. The prince entered his father's study and warned that informal access had become a weakness inside the household. He believed compassion was being mistaken for permission, and permission was being stretched into control. Charles heard the warning, but he also heard the judgment beneath it. William was no longer asking whether the breach was serious. He was asking how long his father would tolerate it. Camilla urged caution when she joined them. The Queen Consort feared that an aggressive response would turn a security failure into another international family scandal. She reminded Charles that Meghan's name would dominate the story before the facts were known. He listened, but refused to call the incident innocent. Security officers then delivered the detail that changed the room. The aide carried no official briefing papers, yet several calls had been exchanged that morning with a member of the king's wider communications staff. One name immediately unsettled William. The same official had attended a private royal reception weeks earlier, where Princess Anne had witnessed a quiet conversation that now looked like the beginning of everything. The crisis did not begin in the corridor. It began 3 weeks earlier, during a private reception at St. James's Palace, when an ordinary exchange near the end of the evening drew the attention of Princess Anne. She saw a senior communications official speaking quietly with Meghan's aide beside a closed gallery door. The conversation lasted less than 4 minutes. Yet before they separated, one sentence was overheard. A sentence that later made Charles view the cancelled briefing as something far more serious. Anne had attended the reception, expecting routine conversations about charities, public service, and future royal support. St. James's Palace, one of the monarchy's historic working residences, often hosts formal gatherings connected to royal duties. That evening, former staff members, government guests, charity representatives, and people linked to international foundations moved through the rooms under careful supervision. Meghan's aide had entered as the registered guest of a charitable consultant, which allowed access to the reception, but not to private corridors or internal palace discussions. The princess noticed the exchange because both figures lowered their voices the moment she approached. The aide leaned toward the senior communications official and said, "We only need the final timing before the announcement." Anne stopped. The words sounded too precise to be casual. She stepped closer and asked which announcement they meant. The official immediately began talking about a charity schedule, while the aide smiled, thanked her, and walked away without answering. Anne did not forget the reaction. Later that night, she found Charles in a private sitting room and described the conversation exactly as she had heard it. The king listened without interruption as his sister explained how quickly both people had changed the subject. She told him the exchange felt rehearsed, not accidental, and warned that someone might be sharing information before royal decisions were approved. Charles resisted the darkest conclusion. He feared that acting on suspicion alone would ignite another conflict involving Harry and destroy what remained of their private contact. The monarch told Anne that proof had to come before punishment. She accepted his caution, but she did not accept his hope that the matter would fade. 2 days later, details from an unpublished palace communications proposal appeared in a private transatlantic discussion involving Sussex advisors. The proposal had not been released, and only a small circle knew its timing, wording, and planned restrictions. Anne immediately understood what the whispered sentence had meant. The truth hardened when security records showed that the same official had authorized the temporary pass later used by Meghan's aide. Anne went directly to William before Charles could be persuaded to dismiss the link. The corridor sighting had confirmed her warning, and now the prince wanted the aide questioned face to face, before anyone inside the palace could erase the truth. The aide was escorted into a small palace reception room where King Charles waited with William and Princess Anne. No cameras were present. No public statement had been prepared. The room contained only 4 chairs, a silent clock, and a question the monarch demanded be answered directly. Why had someone from Meghan's private circle been standing outside a restricted briefing without appearing on the official guest list? The answer would either calm the palace or expose a deeper betrayal. Charles had chosen to speak personally, before security opened a formal investigation. The king wanted one clear explanation, offered without public shame or legal pressure. A formal investigation is an official internal review used to establish who acted, what rules were broken, and whether further action is required. William and Anne remained, because both had warned him that this was not a simple visitor error. The monarch placed the temporary pass on the table and asked, "Who told you there would be a briefing here today?" The aide glanced toward William before answering that the location had been mentioned during a routine scheduling call. The prince challenged the claim at once. Routine staff were not supposed to know the final room, the starting time, or the names of those attending. The aide's calm began to crack. Meghan had not ordered any palace contact, the visitor insisted. Charles reacted immediately, because he had not accused her of giving an order. The king leaned forward and asked why her name had been raised before any allegation had been made. The answer came slowly, and every second deepened the suspicion. Anne then returned to the conversation at St. James's Palace. The princess asked what final timing before the announcement had meant. The aide admitted discussing future communications, but refused to identify the announcement. She pressed again. The visitor repeated that the discussion had been professional and unrelated to any breach. Charles asked to see the phone used that morning. The aide refused, saying it contained confidential work material with no connection to the monarchy. William pushed his chair back and stood, anger finally breaking through his restraint. The prince said that privacy could not be used as a shield after entering a restricted area under an improperly issued pass. The king raised one hand and stopped him. Charles would control the room, and he would control what happened next. He ordered the aide escorted from the palace and suspended every related access privilege until the investigation was complete. The visitor reached the door, then turned and spoke quietly. "The person responsible is closer to the crown than anyone in this room understands." Anne froze. William stared at Charles. That warning changed everything, because the real source was no longer standing outside the palace. It was operating from within it. Royal authority often appears to rest entirely with the monarch, but daily palace power moves through offices, signatures, passes, schedules, and private approvals. Someone had used that machinery to place Meghan's aide near a meeting the aide was never meant to know existed. Charles held the crown. Yet another person had controlled the door. As William examined the internal chain of authority, the investigation moved away from Meghan and toward a trusted official inside the king's own household. William stood beside the security director as each approval record appeared on a secure screen. The prince understood why the details mattered. A temporary access pass is an internal permission record allowing a visitor to move beyond normal public areas, and it cannot be created without authority from a recognized palace office. Meghan's aide had not entered through charm, accident, or personal influence. Someone inside had changed the rules. The future king watched the authorizing code appear beside the visitor's name. His jaw tightened. It belonged to the same senior communications official Anne had seen speaking with the aide at St. James's Palace. The connection was no longer emotional suspicion. It was a recorded action tied to a known palace account. Charles felt the humiliation more deeply than anger. The king had tried to prevent another public war with Harry and Meghan by allowing quiet contact and patient discussion. Now a member of his own household appeared to have used that caution as cover. The cancelled briefing had been designed to tighten communication between royal offices and stop external representatives from learning about announcements before approval. Someone had tried to reach the very meeting meant to close that weakness. Camilla urged restraint. The Queen Consort warned that dismissing a senior official without complete proof could shake every office around the crown and create panic among loyal staff. Charles turned toward her and answered with chilling calm. Keeping a disloyal official, he said, would destroy something more important than stability. It would destroy trust. Security officers then uncovered the method. The official had changed the Aide's visitor classification from external guest to communications consultant, allowing movement beyond the normal reception area. The same code had also been used twice before to admit people linked to overseas media advisors after regular palace hours. Charles summoned the official to his study. The monarch did not offer a chair when the individual entered. He placed the access record on the desk and asked for one honest explanation. The official admitted issuing the pass, but insisted the instruction had come from a member of the extended royal family. The king did not move. William had feared a staff betrayal. Camilla had feared a scandal. Now both possibilities had become something worse. By nightfall, the crisis had moved beyond palace employees, and the first consequences were about to reach those who believed a royal connection could protect them. The cancellation of one briefing quickly became a palace-wide lockdown of trust. Visitor lists were frozen, staff passes were suspended, private meetings were relocated without notice. Every office understood that Charles was searching for the source of the breach, yet no one knew how far the king intended to go. For Meghan, the consequences arrived through a terse call from London. For Harry, they arrived in the form of a father who no longer answered privately. Charles ordered a complete review of temporary access privileges, outside consultants, communications staff, and recent visitors linked to the wider royal circle. The king understood why speed mattered. An access review is an internal security check used to confirm who entered royal property, who approved them, and what areas they were allowed to reach. Until that chain was clear, no office could be trusted to operate as normal. The original briefing was quietly renamed and moved to another part of the palace. Attendance fell to 5 senior figures, and even they received the location only minutes before it began. William supported every restriction. The prince believed the household had already lost control once and could not risk a second breach while the first was still being examined. Meghan demanded answers during a private call with the Aide. She asked why the palace visit had not been disclosed beforehand and whether anyone had used her name to secure access. Her anger was fierce, but fear sharpened every word. She knew Charles might see the incident as a personal operation against him, even if she had never authorized it. The Duchess ended the call and remained seated with the silent phone in her hand. She understood how quickly the story would change. Her name would dominate every palace discussion, every headline, and every argument long before the facts were settled. Once again, someone else's decision had placed her at the center of a royal crisis. Harry tried to call his father. Charles declined and instructed his private secretary to request all further communication in writing until the review ended. The Duke felt the rejection immediately. He was not only being kept away from a palace decision, he was being held at a distance by a father who no longer trusted private words. Camilla worried the silence would deepen the divide beyond repair. The Queen Consort urged the monarch to hear his son before suspicion became permanent. William disagreed, insisting that emotion could not interrupt the investigation. The senior communications official was suspended after failing to produce written proof that a royal relative had authorized the pass. Investigators then recovered a deleted calendar entry marked M.A. Final Confirmation, scheduled 20 minutes before the briefing. Charles now had enough evidence to punish his staff, but not enough to understand Harry's role. The king finally removed the officials, closed the files, and agreed to hear his son without anyone standing between them. There were no private secretaries on the call, no lawyers, and no carefully prepared palace language. Charles spoke as a father, while Harry answered as a son who knew that another invisible wall had risen between them. The king did not begin with accusations against Meghan. He asked only whether Harry had known that the Aide would be inside the palace. The pause before Harry answered was brief, but to Charles it carried the weight of every broken promise between them. Charles had agreed to speak, after receiving a written request from his son, insisting that Meghan had never authorized the Aide to enter a restricted area. The king understood why the distinction mattered. A restricted area is a protected part of a royal residence where only approved staff, officials, or invited guests may enter. Any unofficial presence there could threaten private decisions before they were announced. William had opposed an informal conversation. The prince feared that family emotion would blur a security breach, yet he respected his father's choice. Charles needed a personal answer before issuing a final ruling, and Harry needed one chance to speak without advisors shaping every sentence. The king asked directly whether his son had known about the visit. Harry admitted that the aide planned to meet a palace contact, but insisted he had not known about the briefing or the restricted corridor. Charles felt the betrayal settle deeper. After years of conflict over leaks, access, and private family information, an unofficial channel had still been allowed to continue. Harry's restraint broke. The Duke accused the palace of treating every Sussex connection as a threat before hearing the facts. Charles answered that trust could not survive when important details appeared only after discovery. He had not wanted another confrontation, but silence had protected the very system now dividing them. The son finally revealed through the private recorded call that the aide had been seeking advance clarity about a new palace communications policy. The Sussex team feared being publicly blindsided by an announcement that could limit contact with royal offices. Harry also admitted that the senior communications official had shared limited scheduling information, believing it would prevent another public clash between the households. Charles heard the confession differently than William might have. The true violation was not simply Meghan's aide, nor one frightened decision by Harry. It was the secret network built around the king by people claiming they were protecting family peace, while quietly bypassing his authority. The monarch ended the call without anger. He removed a handwritten note bearing Meghan's name from the center of his desk and placed the palace access records in its place. His decision had been made. But before Charles could announce it, news of the cancelled briefing escaped the palace, and the gates filled with cameras. By morning, the private palace crisis had become an international spectacle. News channels interrupted regular programming, commentators debated Meghan's role, and reporters gathered outside Buckingham Palace before the gates had fully opened. Yet one image captured the public mood more powerfully than any headline. King Charles standing alone beside his car after leaving Clarence House, his expression exhausted, while an aide behind him carried the cancelled briefing folder back inside. The palace confirmed that a scheduled internal briefing had been postponed after an unauthorized access concern, but officials initially refused to name the visitor. An internal briefing is a private meeting where senior royal staff review sensitive decisions before they are announced. The secrecy mattered because any leak could shape public reaction before the Crown had agreed on its final position. Within hours, however, Meghan's aide was identified by international media. The story changed instantly. Broadcasters framed the incident as another direct confrontation between the Sussex household and the monarchy, even though the investigation had already moved toward palace staff. The fictional London Chronicle placed Charles's photograph across its front page, beneath one brutal headline: "The King closes the door." No argument appeared in the image, yet the monarch's exhausted expression made the crisis feel painfully personal. A national broadcaster opened its evening report with words that spread across every discussion. "This is the moment a family dispute became a security decision." Supporters of Meghan argued that the aide had entered through a pass issued by a palace official and was being turned into a convenient target. Royal loyalists answered that seeking advance information about confidential decisions justified immediate exclusion. Charles watched the coverage privately and muted the television when Meghan's photograph appeared beside his own. The king felt frustration rise again. A betrayal by his communications staff had been reduced to another public battle with his daughter-in-law. He had spent years trying to keep family pain separate from royal authority, but the headlines had merged them before the truth could catch up. The palace finally released a documented statement confirming that the senior communications official had authorized the temporary pass without the monarch's knowledge. The official had been permanently removed from the royal household. Charles also made clear through that same statement that no evidence showed Meghan had ordered the aide to approach the briefing room. The decision stopped the crisis from becoming an official accusation against her, but it did not restore trust. Harry had admitted knowing about informal contact. The aide had crossed a protected boundary. Palace staff had hidden the route inside the king's own household. The world had delivered its arguments, but only Charles could deliver the verdict. With blame finally separated from proven misconduct, the monarch prepared a final ruling, defining where Harry, Meghan, their staff, and the palace would stand from that moment onward. King Charles did not answer the crisis with revenge. He answered it with a boundary. The senior official who opened the palace door was dismissed. Meghan's aide lost all access to royal properties. Harry was told that future contact would be direct, documented, and free from hidden intermediaries. Yet the king refused to condemn Meghan for an order she had not given. His final decision was painful but precise. Family ties would remain, while unofficial access to the crown would end permanently. Charles formally approved a new palace rule that changed how outside representatives could enter restricted royal areas. The rule required written clearance from the monarch's private office, the small team that directly manages the king's most sensitive duties and decisions. Staff, advisors, and representatives linked to non-working members of the royal family could no longer rely on informal invitations, private friendships, or verbal approval. The king also ordered Meghan's close aide permanently removed from every royal visitor and event list. The decision was not punishment for serving her. It followed the aide's entry into a protected corridor under an improperly issued pass, and the refusal to provide a complete explanation when questioned. The senior communications official faced an even sharper consequence. Charles dismissed that individual for creating a secret channel that shared confidential scheduling details and bypassed royal authority. The silence after the final order carried its own weight. Charles set down his pen and remained alone, understanding exactly what he had done. Protecting the monarchy had required him to close a door Harry had hoped would stay partly open. The king had preserved the bond between father and son, but he had removed every hidden path around trust. Harry accepted through a private written response that his knowledge of the informal contact had damaged his father's confidence. The Duke had not planned the corridor incident, yet his silence allowed the arrangement to grow. Meghan was cleared of directly ordering the intrusion, but she also recognized that people acting within her circle could still drag her into conflicts she had not created. William viewed the ruling as necessary protection for the future crown. The prince believed royal authority could not survive if private access depended on loyalty to individuals rather than loyalty to the institution. Anne reached a quieter conclusion. The princess saw that Charles had finally placed trust above his fear of another family rupture. 2 days later, the rescheduled palace briefing began. Charles entered the chamber, looked once toward the now empty corridor, and ordered the doors closed before taking his seat. The cancellation had not been a victory over Meghan or a final rejection of Harry. It was the moment the monarch ended the palace culture of secret intermediaries. The king had learned that reconciliation without boundaries creates vulnerability, while authority, without fairness, creates cruelty. By punishing the proven betrayal and refusing to invent a wider accusation, Charles protected the dignity of the crown and the last fragile thread connecting a father to his son. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.